I watched silently as he bragged to his mistress about providing everything for his dependent wife, planning their future in what he thought was our shared mansion. The irony was delicious. Every luxury he enjoyed was bought with my money, through my carefully hidden real estate empire. He didn't know I owned all our properties and his fancy car until the day I made him homeless. The crystal champagne glass felt cool against my palm as I watched my husband Marcus celebrate his promotion at what he thought was our jointly owned beachfront mansion in Newport Beach. 20 of his closest friends and colleagues gathered around. Our marble-topped kitchen island, all of them blissfully unaware that everything they were touching, from the imported Italian tiles to the vintage wine they were drinking, belonged solely to me. Each piece of this $12 million estate had been carefully selected and purchased through one of my many shell companies, long before Marcus ever entered my life. To the good life. Marcus raised his glass, his arm casually draped around his assistant Jessica's waist. The same assistant I'd caught him with in his office last month, their bodies intertwined on the desk I'd gifted him for his birthday. The same woman he'd been secretly planning a future with, using what he thought was our shared wealth. The same mistress who'd been helping him search for a new house online. Ironically, one of my own properties listed through a different shell corporation. I took another sip of water from my crystal glass, maintaining my carefully crafted image of the perfect trophy wife. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. Success isn't about who makes the most noise. It's about who has the patience to wait for the perfect moment. 3 generations of women in my family had built this real estate empire in silence, teaching me the power of staying hidden in plain sight. The security cameras I'd installed throughout the house captured every intimate touch, every whispered promise between them. Each recording added another piece to the evidence I'd been gathering, all while maintaining my facade as the naive, financially dependent spouse. Marcus had no idea that while he played his games, I'd been orchestrating the biggest real estate deal of the year, one that would soon leave him without a penny or a place to call home. Through the French doors, I could see the infinity pool, stretching toward the Pacific, its blue waters reflecting the setting California sun. The view that Marcus loved bragging about to his friends, claiming he'd provided it for his wife. In less than 24 hours, he would learn the true meaning of dependence, when that million-dollar view would become nothing but a bitter memory. "Honey," Marcus called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Why don't you open another bottle of crystal? We're celebrating!" More laughter, more knowing glances between him and Jessica. I caught fragments of their whispered conversation. Plans for a weekend getaway in his beach house in Malibu, another property that actually belonged to me. I forced a submissive smile, playing my role perfectly. Inside, I was reviewing the eviction papers hidden in my private study, scheduled for delivery first thing tomorrow morning. My team of lawyers had spent weeks ensuring everything was airtight. The prenup Marcus had so carelessly signed, thinking he was protecting his assets, had actually secured his fate. Every luxury car, every property, every bank account he thought was joint-owned, all would be proven mine. The sound of breaking crystal echoed from the kitchen. Someone had dropped a champagne flute. Time was when such careless disrespect for my property would have angered me. Now it just added another line item to the bill Marcus would soon be unable to pay. I watched as he laughed it off, telling everyone not to worry about the cheap glass. Jessica whispered something in his ear, and they both glanced at me with poorly concealed pity. I knew what they were thinking, the same thing Marcus had told her in their text messages that my security team had intercepted. "Don't worry about her. She's got nothing without me. No skills, no money, no prenup protection. Just a pretty face who got lucky marrying me." If only they knew about the 3 master's degrees hidden in my private files, or the real estate empire I'd built across 3 states. If only they could see the documents in my study showing that their planned love nest in Malibu was actually my latest acquisition. But they'd learn soon enough. After all, revenge, like prime real estate, is all about 3 things: location, timing, and watching the property value drop. I excused myself quietly, heading toward my study. "Don't wait up, honey," Marcus called after me, his words slurring slightly. "We'll be celebrating late into the night." I heard Jessica's tinkling laugh, accompanied by the sound of another champagne bottle being opened. Perfect. Let them celebrate. In less than 12 hours, the true owner of this celebration would be revealed, and their champagne bubbles would burst along with their carefully constructed illusions. My private study was a sanctuary of truth within, a house built on lies. Behind its mahogany doors, I shed the mask of Marcus's trophy wife and became who I truly was. Catherine Chen, CEO of Pacific Crown Properties, a $500 million real estate empire that officially didn't exist, at least not under my name. I settled into my leather chair, the one Marcus thought he'd surprised me with last Christmas, purchased from one of my own companies through a series of shell corporations. The irony never ceased to amuse me. The hidden panel in my bookshelf slid open silently, revealing 3 high-resolution monitors displaying my real estate portfolio across California, Oregon, and Nevada. Each property a carefully positioned piece in a game Marcus didn't even know he was playing. My phone buzzed, a message from Claire, my most trusted associate, and one of the few who knew my true identity. Final paperwork filed. Judge Thompson. Signed everything. Officers on standby for morning service. I smiled, remembering the day I met Marcus 5 years ago. He'd been so proud, showing off his luxury car dealership, not knowing I owned the building he leased. The memories flooded, back as I reviewed tomorrow's proceedings. I'd learned about the power of hidden ownership from my grandmother, Li Wei Chen, who'd started our family's empire in the 1960s. As a Chinese immigrant woman, she'd discovered that success in America meant playing by different rules. "Let them underestimate you," she'd said. "Their ignorance is your armor." My mother had expanded that philosophy, teaching me how to hide an empire in plain sight. "Men like Marcus," she'd warned when I first introduced him. "They see a beautiful face and assume there's nothing behind it." She'd been right. Marcus had pursued me aggressively, attracted by what he saw as a gorgeous, naive socialite who would look perfect on his arm. The security feed from downstairs showed Marcus getting handsy with Jessica by the pool. I switched to the audio. "Once, everything's settled with the divorce," he was saying. "We'll upgrade to an even bigger place. Poor Catherine won't know what hit her." Jessica giggled, running her hand down his chest. "But what about the prenup? Won't she try to claim half of everything?" Marcus's response made me smile. "The prenup protects all my assets. She'll be lucky if she gets enough for a studio apartment." If only he'd read the document more carefully instead of assuming his lawyer had drafted it. In reality, I'd orchestrated everything through 3 different law firms, creating a labyrinth of legal protection. For me, not him. Through another camera, I watched the party continue to deteriorate. Marcus's friends, all wealthy men who'd looked down on me at social gatherings, were getting sloppier by the minute. One was bragging about his recent real estate investment, a sure thing in Newport Beach. I had to stifle a laugh. I'd sold him that property through 6 degrees of separation, at twice its actual value. My laptop pinged with an email from my private investigator. More photos of Marcus and Jessica. Fancy dinners at restaurants I owned. Weekends at hotels that were part of my portfolio. Shopping sprees charged to credit cards backed by my assets. Each transaction, each indiscretion, each arrogant display of wealth had been documented, categorized, and added to tomorrow's revelation. A gentle knock at the study door interrupted my thoughts. Catherine? It was Linda, Marcus's mother, the woman who'd spent 5 years making snide comments about my expensive tastes and how lucky I was that her son could provide such a lifestyle. I quickly switched my monitors to their dummy screens, showing Pinterest boards of luxury homes before letting her in. "We missed you at the party," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Marcus is telling everyone about his plans to expand the business. Isn't it wonderful how successful my son is?" I nodded, demurely playing my part one last time. Soon she would learn that her son's success had been built on my foundation, and that foundation was about to crumble. After she left, I returned to my preparations. The monitors switched back to my real work: property deeds, bank statements, surveillance footage, and tomorrow's schedule. Years of careful planning had led to this moment. Marcus thought tomorrow was just another Tuesday, another day of playing big shot with my money. Instead, it would be the day he learned the true meaning of dependence. My phone buzzed again. Claire had sent the final confirmation. "Movers on standby. New locks ready. Security team briefed. Everything in place for Operation Glass House." I looked out my study window at the Pacific Ocean, the same view Marcus loved to brag about. By this time tomorrow, he'd be seeing it from the street, where all his possessions would be neatly packed and waiting for him. The party downstairs was reaching its crescendo. I could hear Marcus's booming voice. "To the future, to success, to having everything we've ever wanted." I raised my water glass in a silent toast. "Yes, Marcus," I thought. "To getting exactly what you deserve, dawn arrived with the precision of a well-orchestrated plan." I'd spent the night in my private study, monitoring Marcus and his guests through the security feeds. They'd finally stumbled out around 3 a.m., Jessica giggling as she helped my drunk husband to our bed. I watched through the cameras as they kissed sloppily, whispering about their future together, blissfully unaware of the storm about to break. Now, at 6 a.m., I stood in our gourmet kitchen, preparing Marcus's hangover cure, the same one he'd be desperately missing tomorrow. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the diamonds on my wedding ring. Another piece of Marcus's deception. He'd bragged to everyone about buying it from Cartier, when in reality it had been purchased with my money, like everything else in his life. My phone vibrated silently, a message from Claire. "Legal team assembled, process servers en route, security detail in position." I glanced at the kitchen's security feed, where our housekeeper Maria was already cleaning up last night's destruction. 3 broken crystal glasses, wine stains on my imported Persian rug, and cigarette burns on the Italian marble countertop. All documented, all added to the mounting evidence of Marcus's disrespect for my property. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," Maria whispered as she worked. She was one of the few who knew my true identity. Having worked for my family for 20 years, Mr. Marcus and his friend are still asleep. The disapproval in her voice was clear. She'd seen it all through the years, watching silently as Marcus paraded his infidelity through my home. I checked my watch, 7:30 a.m. In precisely 90 minutes, the first phase would begin. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from my private investigator. Subject J, Jessica, sent multiple texts last night, planning to move in by end of month. Subject M, Marcus, agreed, discussed selling their house. I had to admire their audacity, planning to sell my property out from under me. The sound of stumbling footsteps announced Marcus's arrival. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing last night's rumpled clothes, his eyes bloodshot. Jessica followed close behind, wearing one of my silk robes, the final insult I'd been waiting for. "Morning, honey," Marcus slurred, attempting to appear sober. Jessica crashed in the guest room, too drunk to drive. The lie rolled off his tongue smoothly, practiced. I wondered how many other wives he'd fed similar lines to before me. "Of course," I replied, sliding his hangover cure across the counter. "I'm just heading out for my yoga class." Another carefully crafted deception. Marcus thought I spent my days at yoga studios and lunch dates. In reality, I was overseeing my real estate empire from a penthouse office downtown. "Don't wait up tonight," Marcus called after me. Big client dinner. I caught Jessica's smirk in the reflection of the stainless steel refrigerator. They'd been using these client dinners as cover for months, meeting at high-end restaurants where the staff, unknowingly employed by one of my shell companies, documented their every encounter. The garage door opened silently as I approached. My modest BMW, selected to maintain my facade as the dependent wife, waited beside Marcus's flashy Porsche. The same Porsche he'd surprised me with on our anniversary, financed through one of my own companies. The same car that would be repossessed by tomorrow afternoon. Claire was waiting in my downtown office when I arrived. The space, hidden behind the unmarked door of a seemingly vacant floor, was the true headquarters of my operation. "The teams are in position," she reported, pulling up multiple screens of surveillance footage. "Marcus just left the house with Jessica. They're heading to the Malibu property." I watched through the traffic cameras as Marcus's Porsche wound its way along the coast. He was taking Jessica to what he thought was his secret love nest, a beachfront property he'd discovered through a seemingly independent real estate agent. In reality, it was my latest acquisition, purchased specifically for this moment. "Their realtor called," Claire continued, a slight smile playing at her lips. "They're planning to make an offer today. Marcus told her he'd have no problem coming up with the down payment once he sells his Newport Beach mansion." The audacity was breathtaking. I pulled up the camera feeds from the Malibu house, watching as Marcus led Jessica through the front door, both of them admiring what they thought would be their future home. The hidden microphones picked up their conversation. "Just imagine," Marcus was saying, "once Catherine's out of the picture, this will all be ours. Poor thing won't know what hit her." Jessica's laugh echoed through the speakers. "She really has no idea, does she, about any of it?" "None," Marcus replied smugly. "She thinks I'm her protective husband, managing all our assets. She actually thanked me last week for taking care of everything. Can you believe it?" They collapsed onto the modern sectional sofa, wrapped in each other's arms, planning their future in my house, with my money. I checked the time. 8:45 a.m. In exactly 45 minutes, the first legal documents would be served. Marcus's phone was already buzzing with calls from his office, where my team was beginning the systematic dismantling of his carefully constructed facade. "Claire," I said, straightening my designer blazer, "initiate protocol shattered glass." "Initiate protocol shattered glass," I commanded, and Claire's fingers flew across her keyboard, setting our plan into motion. The first domino was about to fall, and Marcus's house of cards would come tumbling down with it. The screens in my downtown office displayed multiple camera feeds. Marcus and Jessica still canoodling in the Malibu house, the process servers approaching, our Newport Beach mansion, and the security team positioning themselves around all our properties. Meanwhile, my phone lit up with a message that would make this revenge even sweeter. Marcus had just submitted an offer on the Malibu house, using falsified financial documents. "He's committed bank fraud," Claire announced, pulling up the documents. "He claimed the Newport Beach mansion as his personal asset on the loan application, added a few zeros to his annual income, too." I allowed myself a small smile. Sometimes the best trap is the one your target walks into voluntarily. My intercom buzzed. "Ms. Chen, the SEC investigators are here for your meeting." Right on schedule. I'd anonymously reported Marcus's creative accounting at his car dealership, the one he managed and thought he owned, 2 weeks ago. The investigation would reveal that he'd been embezzling funds, thinking he was stealing from himself. In reality, he'd been stealing from me. "Show them in," I instructed, quickly switching my screens to display the evidence we'd gathered. As the investigators filed in, their faces grim with purpose, I transformed from Catherine Chen, secret real estate mogul, into Catherine Chen, concerned wife who'd accidentally discovered her husband's financial misconduct. "Mrs. Chen," the lead investigator began, "thank you for coming forward. These documents you've provided are troubling." I watched as they reviewed years of Marcus's creative bookkeeping, each page adding another nail to the coffin of his freedom. He'd been so careless, so confident in his own cleverness, never imagining that every transaction was being monitored and documented. My phone vibrated. Claire's signal. The process servers had arrived at the Newport Beach mansion. Through the security feeds, I watched as they handed our housekeeper Maria the first set of documents: the official notice of eviction, the restraining order, and the freeze on all accounts Marcus thought were his. "There's something else you should see," I told the SEC investigators, pulling up the footage from the Malibu house. On screen, Marcus was now on the phone with his bank, using my social security number, stolen from what he thought were our joint tax returns, to authorize a wire transfer for the down payment. "Identity theft," the lead investigator noted, adding it to his growing list of charges. "Mrs. Chen, did you authorize your husband to use your social security number?" I shook my head, letting tears well up in my eyes. Years of playing the naive wife had made me an excellent actress. Another buzz from Claire. Marcus had just received the news. I switched to the Malibu house feed, turning up the volume to hear his reaction. "What do you mean, eviction notice?" He was shouting into his phone. "That's my house. I own it. Check again." Jessica stood beside him, her face paling as she listened to his increasingly frantic conversation. "Marcus," she said, tugging at his sleeve, "my bank just called. The credit cards, they're all declined." I watched as the realization began to dawn on them both. The SEC investigators excused themselves, armed with enough evidence to freeze every account and asset Marcus had access to. As the door closed behind them, I allowed myself a moment to savor the unfolding chaos on my screens. Marcus was now attempting to call his lawyer, but the calls weren't going through. Every legal firm in 3 states had been quietly notified of a conflict of interest. They all had connections to my companies. "This is impossible," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I own these properties. I have the paperwork." "Actually," Claire murmured, watching the scene unfold, "he really should have read those documents more carefully." She was right. Every property deed, every car title, every bank account Marcus thought was in his name actually belonged to one of my shell corporations. His signature was there, but not as an owner, as an employee with restricted access that could be revoked at any time. My phone buzzed again, a message from the realtor at the Malibu house. "Security team ready on your signal." I checked the time. In exactly 3 minutes, Marcus would learn the true meaning of homelessness. "Do it," I instructed Claire. With a few keystrokes, she activated the final phase. The smart locks throughout the Malibu house clicked shut. The security gates closed. And Marcus's access codes to every property were simultaneously deactivated. Through the cameras, I watched as realization dawned on Marcus's face. The front door wouldn't open. His key fob didn't work. Even his fingerprint previously programmed into the security system was now denied. "What's happening?" Jessica's panic was evident in her voice. "Marcus, what's going on?" But Marcus couldn't answer. He was staring at his phone where notifications were popping up one after another. Access denied, account frozen, transaction canceled, lease terminated. A new figure appeared on the security feed. Thomas, my head of security, approaching the house with 2 uniformed officers. "Mr. Watson," he called out formally, using Marcus's surname for the first time in years, "I have here a notice of trespass. You and your companion need to vacate the premises immediately." I watched as Marcus's world crumbled in real time. Each attempt to assert ownership, each claim of authority, was met with cold legal reality. He wasn't the owner. He had never been the owner. Everything he thought was his was about to be taken away, just as he had planned to take everything from me. "Claire," I said, standing up and straightening my jacket, "I think it's time we paid our Newport Beach property a visit. After all," I smiled, picking up my keys. Someone needs to personally deliver the divorce papers. The drive to Newport Beach was a symphony of chaos playing out through my car's integrated communication system. Claire's updates came in rapid succession, each one marking another piece of Marcus's world crumbling away. His corporate credit cards are all declined, she reported as I navigated through afternoon traffic. He's tried calling the bank 7 times. They keep redirecting him to their fraud department. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. The best part? He's demanding to speak to the owner of the bank, who happens to be one of your shell corporations. Through my car's dashboard screen, I watched multiple security feeds. Marcus and Jessica had been escorted from the Malibu property, their belongings hastily stuffed into her designer handbag. They'd tried using his Porsche to leave, only to find it wouldn't start. The smart key system had been remotely deactivated. They lie. Newport Beach police just arrived at the mansion, Claire continued. Right on schedule. They're responding to our report about unauthorized occupants. Another screen showed Marcus's mother, Linda, arriving at the Newport Beach house in her Mercedes, the one Marcus had gifted her using my money. She'd be learning some hard truths today, too. I pulled into the private drive of our Newport Beach estate, where 2 police cruisers were already parked. Through my tinted windows, I could see Linda gesticulating wildly at the officers, her face red with indignation. Maria, my loyal housekeeper, stood calmly by the door, holding the stack of legal documents that would shatter their illusions. Your timing is perfect, Claire's voice came through my earpiece. Marcus just called his lawyer. Again. The lawyer's response, who do you think has been paying my retainer all these years? I allowed myself a small smile as I parked. Another piece of Marcus's carefully constructed facade was cracking. As I stepped out of my car, Linda's voice carried across the circular driveway. This is ridiculous. My son owns this house. I helped him pick it out. The police officers remained professionally stoic, one of them holding up the property deed that clearly showed the true owner. Pacific. Crown Properties, LLC, my company, LLC. Actually, Linda? I called out, my heels clicking against the imported Italian marble of the driveway. Your son has never owned any of this. I was no longer playing the role of the submissive daughter-in-law. My Chanel suit and Louboutin heels, paid for with my money, not her son's, radiated authority. Catherine? Linda's voice faltered as she took in my transformed appearance. Gone was the meek, grateful daughter-in-law. In my place stood the true owner of everything she thought her son had provided. What is this? My phone buzzed. Marcus. And Jessica had finally managed to get a rideshare to the Newport Beach house. Perfect timing. I wanted them here for this. Officers, I addressed the police. The unauthorized occupants are about to arrive. Please ensure they remain calm. Linda was still sputtering, trying to reconcile my new demeanor with her understanding of reality. But Marcus said. She trailed off as another security team arrived. This one from my private force, carrying boxes of documents. Marcus said a lot of things, Linda, I replied, taking the first box from the security team. Let's review some of them, shall we? I began laying out papers on the hood of her Mercedes, the one I would be repossessing shortly. Here's the deed to this house, purchased by my company 3 years before I met your son. Here's the title to your car, also owned by my company. And here, I pulled out a particularly thick folder, are records of every dollar your son has embezzled, thinking he was stealing from himself. A car door slammed behind us. Marcus and Jessica had arrived, looking disheveled and panicked. What the hell is going on? Marcus demanded, storming toward us. The police officers stepped forward, hands on their belts. Catherine, what have you done? No, Marcus, I corrected him, my voice calm and clear. The question is, what have you done? Let's start with bank fraud, identity theft, embezzlement. I gestured to the growing pile of evidence. Or should we begin with your plans to sell property you don't own? Jessica hung back. Her earlier confidence evaporated as she watched Marcus's face cycle through confusion, anger, and finally, dawning horror. That's not— I own all of this. I have proof. He reached for his phone, only to find it disconnected from all the banking and real estate apps he'd used to maintain his illusion of wealth. Claire, I spoke into my earpiece, please activate the house security protocol. The mansion's exterior lights suddenly illuminated, despite the afternoon sun. Through the windows, we could see the interior lights flashing. The smart home system Marcus had bragged about installing was now broadcasting its true allegiance. All these years, I continued, addressing not just Marcus but his mother and mistress as well, you thought you were the powerful one, the provider, the success story. I picked up another document, the prenup he'd insisted upon. You never even read the fine print, did you? Too confident in your own importance to check who really owned what. Linda had sunk onto a decorative bench, her worldview visibly shattering. Jessica was already edging toward her car, sensing that her dream of luxury was evaporating. And Marcus was finally seeing me, really seeing me, for the first time. The cars, the houses, the bank accounts, I listed, watching his face crumple with each word. The company you thought you managed, the properties you thought you owned, even the watch you're wearing right now. All of it, every single piece, belongs to me, always has. As if on cue, the fountain in the center of the driveway sprang to life, its water dancing in complex patterns. Another system Marcus had claimed to install. You see, Marcus, while you were busy playing the role of the successful businessman, I was actually building an empire. The only difference is, I didn't need everyone to know about it. I handed the final set of papers to the police officers. These gentlemen will escort you off the property. Your personal belongings will be delivered to your mother's apartment, the one she actually owns. I turned to Jessica, who was already halfway to her car. I'd check those credit cards of yours, dear. They were all authorized under Marcus's now frozen accounts. The look of absolute devastation on Marcus's face was almost worth the years of playing the submissive wife. Almost. But the real satisfaction would come from knowing that every time he tried to rebuild, every time he thought he'd found his footing, he'd discover another piece of his world belonged to me. The next few hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of consequences. I watched from my home office, now openly my command center, as Marcus's world continued to implode. Each attempt he made to salvage his situation only revealed another layer of his powerlessness. His personal email has been locked, Claire reported, monitoring the digital aftermath. All company accounts deactivated. His social media platforms are flagging suspicious activity due to the sudden location changes. She paused, a slight smile in her voice. He's currently trying to check into the Four Seasons using his corporate card. I pulled up the hotel's security feed, another property secretly under my ownership. Marcus stood at the front desk, his designer suit now wrinkled, his confidence shattered. Jessica had already abandoned him, her last text message displayed on my monitor. This isn't what I signed up for. Don't contact me again. Let's see what else he tries, I instructed Claire, settling into my leather chair. The wall of monitors before me told multiple stories. Marcus's mother, Linda, was frantically calling family members, discovering that none of their luxury vehicles or vacation properties were actually in their names. The SEC investigators were combing through the car dealership's records, uncovering years of Marcus's creative accounting. And my security teams were changing locks and access codes at every property Marcus had ever claimed as his own. My phone buzzed with a message from Thomas, my head of security. M attempted access at Beverly Hills condo. Denied. Currently arguing with doorman. I switched to that building's cameras, watching as Marcus gestured angrily at the impassive security staff, the same staff who had been reporting his comings and goings with Jessica to me for months. His credit score just updated, Claire noted, tracking the digital devastation. From 8:50 to 4:10 in 3 hours. Must be some kind of record. She pulled up another screen. The bank is flagging all his recent transactions as suspicious. They're questioning that wire transfer he attempted for the Malibu house. I stood walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Newport Beach mansion. The same windows Marcus had loved showing off to his friends, bragging about his success. Now he couldn't even get past the front gate. The security system had logged 12 attempted entries in the past hour alone. "What's the status on his possessions?" I asked, watching as another moving truck arrived. Claire consulted her tablet. "Teams are cataloging everything. Personal items will be delivered to his mother's apartment. Company property, which is basically everything he thought he owned, is being returned to our storage facilities." A notification popped up on my primary screen. Marcus was attempting to contact his brother, a partner at one of Los Angeles's top law firms. "Play the audio," I instructed. The conversation filled my office. "John, you don't understand. She took everything. The houses, the cars, the accounts. She says none of it was ever mine." "Marcus," his brother's voice was strained. "I just checked the records. Catherine, she's not just your wife. She's Alexandra Chen. The Alexandra Chen. Our firm can't represent you against her. No firm in California will. Do you have any idea how many properties she owns?" The call ended abruptly. I smiled, remembering how Marcus had once mocked my suggestion that he diversify his legal contacts. "Too many lawyers spoil the business," he'd said confidently. He hadn't known that every major law firm in 3 states had connections to my real estate empire. "His friends are starting to respond," Claire reported, monitoring social media and phone traffic. "The ones who were at the party last night? They're all discovering their own connections to your companies. That hedge fund manager who was mocking your investment advice? His firm's building lease is owned by Pacific Crown Properties." Through various security feeds, I watched as Marcus's support system crumbled. His country club membership, revoked. His favorite restaurants, all subtly connected to my companies, suddenly couldn't find his reservations. Even his tailor, who had bragged about making suits for the great Marcus Watson, was now too busy to take his calls. "He's getting desperate," Thomas reported via text. "Tried to access the business center at the Beverly Wilshire. Claimed he needed to print some important documents. Another property under my control. Another door closed in his face." Linda was still at the Newport Beach house gates, alternating between tears and threats. "You can't do this to my son," she shouted at the security cameras. "We'll fight this." Behind her, the movers continued efficiently packing up her Mercedes, the one Marcus had given her using my money, the one that would soon be returned to my corporate fleet. "Should we let her keep anything?" Claire asked, watching the scene. I considered for a moment. The personal items only. Family photos, clothes she actually bought herself, legitimate gifts. Everything else gets cataloged and returned to inventory. My phone lit up with a notification from my banking app. Marcus had found an ATM and was attempting to withdraw cash, using every card in his wallet. Each attempt was met with the same response: account access denied. I watched through the ATM's security camera as he slumped against the wall, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. "Claire," I said, turning back to my desk, "initiate phase 2 of protocol shattered glass." She nodded, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "Time to show Marcus what true homelessness feels like?" "Exactly," I replied, picking up a stack of documents. "But first, let's make sure he understands exactly how he got here. Send copies of his fraudulent loan applications to the SEC. Forward his expense reports to the IRS. And Claire?" I paused, allowing myself a moment of satisfaction. "Make sure every luxury car dealership in California knows that Marcus Watson is no longer authorized to represent any of our interests." The sun was setting over the Pacific, casting long shadows through my office windows. Somewhere out there, Marcus was discovering that every safety net he thought he had was woven from threads I controlled. Every backup plan he might devise would lead him straight into another web of my making. "One last thing," I told Claire. "Make sure all security teams understand. Marcus Watson is no longer family. He's just another unauthorized user trying to access what was never his." As night fell over Newport Beach, I sat in my newly reclaimed home office, watching the full impact of Marcus's downfall ripple through our social circles. Claire had organized the security feeds into a grid on my main monitor, each screen telling its own story of destruction. "His LinkedIn profile just updated automatically," Claire reported, a hint of amusement in her voice. "All those companies he claimed to own? The system's flagging them as inaccurate employment history." She pulled up the profile in question. 5 years of carefully crafted lies, unraveling in real time. The security feed from the Beverly Hills Tennis Club, another property in my portfolio, showed Marcus attempting to access his regular Wednesday court time. The same court where he'd conducted countless business meetings with Jessica. The membership director, who had always greeted him with fawning deference, now merely shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Watson, but your membership was tied to your corporate position. A position that, according to our records, was never actually yours." "He's getting creative," Thomas messaged, sending a new video feed. Marcus was at the Century City Mall, trying to convince the Apple Store to let him access his cloud storage. Claims he has proof of ownership for everything, stored in his digital files. What he didn't know was that those files had already been transferred to my secure servers, documented, and added to the growing evidence of his fraud. My phone buzzed with an update from my private investigator. Marcus's mother, Linda, had finally left the Newport Beach property, but not before creating a scene that would have the neighborhood talking for months. "You'll regret this," she'd screamed at the security cameras. "My son built this life. You're nothing without him." I allowed myself a small laugh at that. If only she knew about the trust fund she thought Marcus had set up for her, the one that had actually been established by my family's foundation. "Claire, make sure Linda's basic needs are covered. Freeze the excess funds, but leave her enough for rent and groceries. I'm not completely heartless." "Unlike your husband," Claire muttered, typing in the instructions. "Speaking of which, his attempts to access various properties in the last 4 hours." She displayed a map of Los Angeles, red dots indicating each failed entry attempt. The pattern showed increasing desperation, from luxury hotels to business centers to storage facilities. "Jessica's making moves," Thomas reported next. The security feed from the Malibu house showed her attempting to retrieve items she'd left there during their rendezvous. "She's claiming some of the artwork and jewelry as gifts." I pulled up my inventory database, each piece meticulously cataloged with purchase dates and ownership documentation. "Send her this," I instructed Claire, forwarding a file. "A complete list of every item she accepted from Marcus, along with proof that they were purchased with embezzled funds. Let her decide if she wants to face accessories charges." Within minutes, the Malibu cameras showed Jessica hastily retreating to her car. Marcus's latest location popped up on my tracker. He was at an upscale bar in West Hollywood, one he'd frequently visited to impress clients. I switched to the interior cameras just in time to hear the bartender's apologetic voice. "I'm sorry, Mr. Watson, but your membership has been revoked, and your cards are all declining." "Do you know who I am?" Marcus's voice carried that entitled tone I'd grown to despise. "I own half the properties in this city." The bartender's response was perfect. "According to our records, sir, you don't even own the shoes you're wearing." He wasn't wrong. The Italian leather shoes, like everything else Marcus wore, had been purchased through my companies. "Should we repossess his wardrobe?" Claire asked, only half joking. I considered it for a moment. Let him keep the suits. He'll need them for his court appearances. A new alert flashed across my screen. Marcus had finally called his father. The conversation was brief but revealing. "Dad, I need help. No, you don't understand. Everything's gone. What do you mean, check the property records? Of course Wait, what do you mean you always knew? I smiled at that. Marcus's father, unlike his son, had done his due diligence years ago. He'd discovered my true identity, but had kept quiet, hoping Marcus would learn responsibility. Your wife, he was, now telling his son, is Alexandra Chen. If you'd spent less time showing off and more time paying attention, you'd have known that. His credit cards are all officially canceled, Claire updated. Banks have frozen his accounts pending fraud investigations. The car dealership board is meeting tomorrow to review his position. She paused, checking another screen. Oh, and that exclusive preschool he promised Jessica for their future children? They've withdrawn his donation and foundation membership. Through the cameras, I watched Marcus exit the bar, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His perfect hair was disheveled, his designer suit wrinkled. The confident strut he'd always affected had been replaced by an uncertain shuffle. For the first time in his life, Marcus Watson was experiencing genuine consequences. He's calling a car service, Thomas reported. I checked the address Marcus had entered, his mother's apartment. The only property in their family that I didn't control. Let him go, I instructed, but maintain surveillance. Something tells me Marcus isn't done trying to salvage his illusion. Claire pulled up one final report for the evening. His total attempted transactions today, 147,543 hours, all declined. Number of properties he's tried to access, 17. Number of lawyers who've refused to take his case, 8. She looked up from her tablet. Want to know the best part? He still hasn't figured out that his phone and email are documenting every desperate move. I stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker below. Somewhere out there, Marcus was beginning to understand the true meaning of dependency. Every privilege he'd taken for granted, every luxury he'd flaunted, every bit of status he'd claimed, all of it had been built on my foundation. And now that foundation was crumbling beneath his feet. Dawn broke over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have normally been visible from every window of my Malibu estate. But Marcus wasn't there to see it. According to the surveillance feeds, he'd spent the night on his mother's couch, his world reduced to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Van Nuys, the only property in his family truly owned by its occupant. He's awake, Claire announced, monitoring the morning's activities. First attempt to access his accounts was at 5:47 a.m. Failed, of course. Then he tried his backup email, his PayPal, even his cryptocurrency wallet. She paused, allowing herself a small smile. Apparently, he forgot who set up his digital currency portfolio. I watched through the building's security cameras as Marcus paced his mother's small living room, his designer suit now hopelessly wrinkled, his carefully maintained appearance showing the strain of his new reality. Linda hovered nearby, her own perfectly curated image similarly disheveled. The SEC investigators are ready, Thomas reported via secure message. They've completed their initial review of the dealership records. Would you like to hear the preliminary findings? I nodded, though I already knew what they'd discover. Every fraudulent transaction, every manipulated record, every embezzled dollar had been meticulously documented long before I'd pulled the trigger on Marcus's downfall. His friends are starting to distance themselves publicly, Claire noted, pulling up various social media feeds. The same people who'd been celebrating with Marcus just 2 nights ago were now scrubbing their profiles of any connection to him. His golf buddies at the country club have requested new playing partners. The charity board he sat on has issued a statement accepting his immediate resignation. My phone buzzed with a message from Jessica's lawyer. She's offering to cooperate, Claire read over my shoulder. Says she has texts, emails, evidence of his plans to sell properties he didn't own. I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Marcus's mistress, the woman he'd planned to rebuild his life with, was now actively participating in his destruction. Put it with the others, I instructed. The evidence wall in my office was already impressive. Banking records? Fraudulent. Loan applications, forged signatures, and surveillance footage. Each piece carefully collected over years of patient observation. And make sure Ms. Jessica understands that her cooperation doesn't guarantee immunity from accessory charges. A new alert flashed across my screens. Marcus was on the move. He's called an Uber, Thomas reported. Destination, Pacific Crown. Property's main office. So he'd finally figured it out. Time for the final act. Claire, initiate Protocol Glass Tower, I commanded, standing to prepare for the confrontation I'd been anticipating. And make sure all security cameras in the building are recording. This should be educational. Within 30 minutes, Marcus stormed into the lobby of my corporate headquarters, a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Los Angeles that he'd driven past countless times without ever realizing its significance. The security feeds showed him attempting to bluster his way past reception, only to be stopped by my waiting security team. Sir? Thomas's voice was professionally neutral as he intercepted Marcus. Ms. Chen is expecting you. Please follow me. The look of confusion on Marcus's face was priceless. He still hadn't fully grasped who Alexandra Chen really was. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, each floor's ascent marking another step in Marcus's journey toward complete understanding. When the doors opened to my executive suite, the transformation in his expression was remarkable. Gone was the arrogant man who'd mocked his dependent wife. In his place stood someone beginning to comprehend the true depth of his situation. Catherine? His voice cracked as he took in my appearance. No longer the submissive wife, but the powerful CEO he'd never recognized. What is all this? I gestured to the wall of windows behind my desk, each offering a different view of properties I owned. This, Marcus, is what real success looks like. Not the borrowed status you've been flaunting, but actual, earned power. I pressed a button, and the windows transformed into screens, each displaying a different aspect of his fraudulent activities. Every property you claimed to own, I began, pointing to the displays. Every car you gifted to friends and family, every account you've accessed, every loan you've applied for, every piece of evidence you thought you could use against me. It's all here, documented, dated, and delivered to the relevant authorities. Marcus sank into a chair, his legs seemingly unable to support him. But the prenup, my lawyers. He trailed off as realization dawned. The lawyers. They were yours all along, weren't they? Everything was mine, Marcus. The houses, the cars, the bank accounts, even the clothes on your back. I pulled up footage from his various indiscretions with Jessica, including the hotels where you met. Your mistress. Did you really think I wouldn't notice you using my properties for your affairs? His face cycled through emotions. Shock, anger, fear, and finally, a desperate kind of calculation. We can work this out, he began, attempting to summon his old charm. You're my wife. We can… Actually, I interrupted, sliding a document across my desk. As of this morning, I'm not. The divorce is already final. Amazing how quickly things move when you own the building the courthouse is in. I watched as he scanned the paper, his hands trembling. You'll find that the prenup you so confidently signed protects all of my assets, which, as it turns out, is everything you thought was yours. On cue, Claire entered with another stack of documents. The SEC findings, Ms. Chen. They're ready to proceed with charges. She placed them deliberately in front of Marcus, whose face had gone ashen. The FBI is particularly interested in the identity theft aspects, and the IRS has some questions about certain creative deductions. Marcus lunged for the papers, but Thomas was faster, stepping between us with practiced efficiency. Don't embarrass yourself further, I advised, watching my once proud husband crumble. The evidence has already been filed. Your accounts are frozen. Your assets, which were never really yours, are secured. And your future. I gestured to the screens, now showing his multiple failed attempts to access various properties. Is exactly what you deserve. As security escorted him out, I turned to Claire. Make sure his mother's apartment remains untouched. Let him experience what true dependency feels like. After all, I thought, watching him shuffle into the elevator, real power isn't in what you take away. It's in what you allow others to keep. The week following Marcus's confrontation in my office unfolded like a masterclass in consequence. Each day brought new revelations, not just for Marcus, but for everyone who'd enabled his charade over the years. The SEC investigation has expanded, Claire reported during our morning briefing. They're looking into everyone who helped Marcus maintain his facade. That includes the bank managers who overlooked discrepancies, the business partners who turned a blind eye to his fraud, even the country club board members who accepted his inflated financial statements. I reviewed the latest surveillance footage on my monitors. Marcus had spent the past week making increasingly desperate attempts to salvage something, anything, from his former life. Each attempt only served to dig him deeper into legal trouble. He tried to sell the Rolex yesterday, Thomas added, pulling up security footage from a luxury watch dealer in Beverly Hills. Claimed it was his personal property. Unfortunately, for him, we have the original purchase records showing it was bought with company funds. The video showed Marcus being escorted out by security, another door literally closing in his face. Linda, his mother, had launched a social media campaign attempting to paint Marcus as the victim of a manipulative wife. That backfired spectacularly. When my legal team released documentation of every luxury item she'd accepted from her son, all purchased with embezzled funds. Her posts have gone quiet, Claire noted, checking the social media feeds. Probably because the IRS is now investigating all those gifts she received. Turns out Marcus wasn't just giving her cars and jewelry, he was helping her evade taxes too. Jessica had made her own desperate moves, attempting to sell her story to several gossip websites. Should we be concerned? Claire asked, showing me the preliminary articles. I shook my head, pulling up our contingency files. Release these instead, I instructed, sending over a carefully curated set of documents. Every expense report where she charged personal items to the company. Every email where she discussed their plans to take over Marcus's properties. Let her try to spin that into a sympathetic narrative. The fallout wasn't limited to Marcus's immediate circle. His former business associates were scrambling to distance themselves, each discovery of fraud leading to another unraveling thread. The car dealership audit is complete, Claire reported. They found evidence of systematic fraud going back years. Marcus wasn't just embezzling from you, he was running a complex scheme involving multiple employees. She displayed a chart showing the network of corruption Marcus had built. Several of his managers are now facing criminal charges. Through our surveillance network, we tracked Marcus's increasingly frantic attempts to rebuild. He'd tried approaching his old contacts in the real estate world, only to discover that every significant property developer in Los Angeles had connections to my companies. He attempted to apply for a position at Robertson Real Estate this morning, Thomas reported, showing me the application. Used you as a reference. The irony was delicious. Robertson was one of my earliest acquisitions, though it still operated under its original name. My phone buzzed with an update from my private investigator. Marcus had been spotted meeting with a known fraudster in a downtown coffee shop. Send the footage to the FBI, I instructed Claire. Let's add attempted conspiracy to his growing list of charges. Linda had finally stopped defending her son publicly, especially after discovering that her own financial situation was more precarious than she'd realized. She's put her apartment up for sale, Claire noted. Apparently, she needs the money for legal representation. Make sure she gets a fair price, I instructed. Have Pacific Crown Properties submit an offer through a subsidiary. Let's not be completely ruthless. After all, her only real crime had been blind faith in her son's lies. Jessica's attempts to cash in on the scandal had backfired spectacularly. The evidence we'd released showed her as an active participant in Marcus's schemes, not an innocent bystander. "She's been let go from her position," Claire reported. "Seems companies aren't eager to hire someone who helped plan corporate fraud." The professional consequences continued to multiply. Marcus's former colleagues at the dealership, realizing the extent of his deception, had turned state's evidence. Each new testimony added another charge to his growing legal troubles. "His lawyer quit this morning," Thomas announced, displaying the court filing, "cited irreconcilable differences and lack of candor from the client." The security feeds showed Marcus leaving the law office, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Even Marcus's favorite bartender, who had once proudly claimed to be his personal mixologist, had given a statement to investigators about conversations he'd overheard. Conversations where Marcus had brazenly discussed his fraudulent activities. "The FBI has expanded their investigation to include money laundering charges," Claire noted, reviewing the latest legal updates. Apparently, Marcus didn't just embezzle funds. He helped several of his friends hide assets, too. They're not very happy about being dragged into this. I watched through various security feeds as Marcus's world continued to shrink. His access to luxury had been cut off, his social circles had evaporated, and his legal troubles were mounting. The man who had once mocked my supposed financial dependency was now truly dependent. On his mother's couch, on public transportation, on the mercy of investigators. "He tried to contact you again," Claire mentioned, displaying his latest blocked message. "Says he can explain everything, that there's been a huge misunderstanding." The desperation in his words was palpable, but it was far too late for explanations. "Forward it to the investigators," I instructed. "Every contact attempt, every excuse, every lie just adds to their case." After all, the best revenge wasn't just in the initial fall. It was in ensuring that every attempt to rise again only dug the hole deeper. 1 month after Marcus's world imploded, I sat in my penthouse office reviewing the transformations his downfall had triggered across Los Angeles's real estate and business communities. The ripples had become waves, affecting far more than just my ex-husband's immediate circle. "The FBI's investigation has expanded to 3 more dealerships," Claire reported, displaying a map of affected businesses. "Turns out Marcus's creative accounting methods weren't unique to him. They've uncovered a whole network of fraud in the luxury car industry." I studied the latest reports on my screens. The exposure of Marcus's schemes had sparked a broader examination of how wealthy men in Los Angeles manipulated property ownership and financial records. Several prominent figures, all associates of Marcus, were now facing their own investigations. "The Real Estate Commission is implementing new verification protocols," Claire continued, pulling up the regulatory updates. "They're calling it the Watson Rule, mandatory authentication of all ownership claims and thorough background checks on all major transactions." The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus's attempts to fake ownership had led to stricter oversight of genuine property rights. Through my network of cameras and contacts, I monitored the changing landscape. The country club where Marcus had once held court had undergone a complete membership review, discovering that several other members had similarly misrepresented their financial status and property ownership. The audit committee found 12 other cases of fraudulent membership applications, Thomas reported, sending over the findings, all of them connected to Marcus's social circle. They're restructuring their entire verification process. My phone buzzed with an update from my private investigator. The social transformation had been particularly fascinating to watch. Marcus's former friends, the same ones who had laughed at his jokes about his dependent wife, were now scrambling to prove their own legitimacy. 4 divorce filings this week alone, Claire noted, checking the court records. All from wives who, inspired by your example, started investigating their husband's financial claims. Turns out Marcus wasn't the only one playing games with shared assets. The changes weren't limited to personal relationships. Banks had initiated reviews of all high-value accounts, particularly focusing on property-based loans and credit lines. Marcus's fraud had exposed vulnerabilities in their verification systems, leading to major policy overhauls. Goldman Stanley is implementing new authentication requirements, Claire reported, showing me the internal memo. They're specifically citing the Watson case as a catalyst for change. Every luxury car lease, every property-backed loan, every high-value transaction now requires multiple levels of verification. Through the security feeds, I watched as another of Marcus's former associates was escorted from his office by FBI agents. The investigation had revealed a web of mutual deception, each man helping others maintain their facades while building their own houses of cards. The DA's office has created a special task force, Thomas added, forwarding their press release. They're focusing on property fraud and identity theft in high-net-worth cases. Your evidence against Marcus opened their eyes to how prevalent these schemes are. Linda's social circle had undergone its own transformation. The women who had once competed to showcase their son's success were now quietly hiring forensic accountants to verify their family's assets. 3 more mothers from Linda's Bridge Club have discovered similar situations, Claire noted, displaying their social media activity. Their sons had all followed Marcus's example, creating illusions of wealth through fraudulent means. They're calling it the Marcus Watson wake-up call. Jessica's story had sparked its own revolution among executive assistants and office staff. Many had come forward with evidence of similar schemes they'd been pressured to facilitate. The whistleblower. Protection Program has received 47 new cases, Claire reported, showing me the statistics. All inspired by the Watson case, companies across Los Angeles are strengthening their compliance programs in response. I pulled up the security feed from my Malibu property, the one Marcus had tried to buy for Jessica. The real estate agent was now using it as a cautionary tale during showings, warning potential buyers about the importance of verifying ownership claims and financial statements. The property market is actually stabilizing, Claire noted, displaying market trends. Without inflated claims and fraudulent applications distorting values, we're seeing more realistic pricing and genuine transactions. My phone lit up with a message from an unexpected source, the dean of a prominent business school. They wanted to use the Watson case as a teaching tool, an example of how financial fraud intersects with social pretense and gender assumptions. They're particularly interested in how you maintained your cover while building your empire, Claire mentioned, showing me the course outline. They want to explore the societal factors that made your deception necessary and successful. Through various cameras, I watched as Los Angeles's business community continued to transform. Law firms were strengthening their due diligence procedures. Accounting firms were developing new fraud detection protocols. Even social clubs were implementing stricter membership verification processes. The Watson effect, as the media had dubbed it, had exposed the fragility of status based on appearances. Marcus's downfall had become a cautionary tale, prompting a widespread reevaluation of how wealth and success were verified and validated. His legacy, Claire observed, reviewing the latest news coverage, is becoming something he never intended, a complete overhaul of how Los Angeles's elite prove their worth. I stood by my office windows, watching the city below. Marcus had wanted to be remembered as a successful businessman, a man of property and influence. Instead, his name had become synonymous with fraud and pretense, a warning to others who might attempt similar deceptions. One more thing, Claire added, checking her final reports. The FBI is using your documentation methods as a template for their financial crimes division. They're calling it the Chen Protocol, systematic evidence gathering for long-term fraud investigations. The sun was setting over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the city Marcus had once thought he owned. In his attempt to create an illusion of success, he had inadvertently sparked a revolution in how success itself was verified and valued. Sometimes, I reflected, the biggest changes come from the smallest deceptions being exposed to the light. 6 months after Marcus's downfall, I stood in my Newport Beach mansion's master suite, watching the sunset paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold. The same view Marcus had once claimed credit for providing now served as a daily reminder of how completely the tables had turned. "Final update on Marcus Watson," Claire announced, entering with her tablet. "He took a plea deal this morning, 5 years in federal prison, full restitution orders, and complete cooperation with ongoing investigations." She displayed the court documents showing Marcus's signature, no longer confident and flourishing, but shaky and small. The security feeds showed Marcus's last moments of freedom. Gone was the designer suit-wearing executive who had mocked his dependent wife. In his place stood a broken man in off-the-rack clothing, being led away by federal marshals. His mother, Linda, watched from the courthouse steps, her own life transformed by her son's deceptions. Jessica submitted her final testimony yesterday, Thomas reported via secure message. She's agreed to return all gifts and pay restitution for her role in the fraud. In exchange for immunity, she's provided evidence against 12 other executives involved in similar schemes. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Watson case triggers national reform in property verification. The article detailed how banks and real estate firms across the country were implementing new protocols to prevent similar frauds. Marcus's attempt to fake success had inadvertently created a more transparent system for proving genuine achievement. Linda's book deal fell through, Claire noted, checking her updates. Publishers weren't interested in another "my son is misunderstood" narrative. However, she smiled slightly. 3 other wives from her social circle are writing about discovering their husband's financial deceptions. They're calling it the Watson Wives Wake-Up Call. Through my vast network of cameras and contacts, I watched the final pieces of Marcus's former life disappear. The car dealership had been completely restructured, its legitimate employees retained under new management. The country club had instituted the Watson Rule, requiring annual verification of members' financial claims. Even his favorite restaurants had new ownership, all properly documented and verified. His prison assignment came through, Thomas reported. Minimum security, but no special privileges. He'll be sharing a cell with another former executive, who also falsified property ownership. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus would finally experience true dependency, not just the illusion he'd accused me of. Linda had finally sold her apartment to one of my shell companies. Though she didn't know it, I'd ensured she received a fair price. After all, her main crime had been blind faith in her son's lies. She'd moved to Arizona, far from the society that now whispered about the Watson family's fall from grace. "The FBI's final report is impressive," Claire commented, displaying the document. "They're using your evidence-gathering methods as a template for future investigations. Your systematic documentation of Marcus's fraud has become a case study in several law enforcement training programs." My phone lit up with a message from an unexpected source. Marcus's father. Unlike his ex-wife, he had maintained a dignified silence throughout the scandal. His message was simple. You did what needed to be done. He needed to learn this lesson. Through the security feeds, I watched the last of Marcus's possessions being cataloged and processed as evidence. The Rolex watches, the designer suits, the luxury cars, all properly documented as purchased with fraudulent funds, his entire life of pretense reduced to exhibits in a federal case. Final tallies, Claire reported, pulling up the spreadsheets. Total fraud amount, $17.3 million. Properties falsely claimed, 23. Vehicles improperly obtained, 15. Victims of secondary fraud schemes, 34. She paused, checking another screen. And your net worth? Up 22% since the revelation, as your property's true ownership became public knowledge. I moved to my private study, No longer hidden, no longer necessary to maintain the facade of the dependent wife. The wall of monitors showed my real estate. Empire operating smoothly, transparently, legitimately. Everything Marcus had tried to fake, I had actually built. One last thing, Claire added, displaying a final document. The business schools want to expand their case study. They're particularly interested in how societal assumptions about women in business allowed you to hide in plain sight for so long. I smiled, remembering all the times Marcus had dismissed my business suggestions, mocked my investment ideas, laughed at my naive questions about his financial dealings. Each dismissal had been another brick in the wall of his own destruction. "Should we release the final evidence?" Claire asked, indicating the remaining files we'd held back. I considered for a moment, then shook my head. Some cards were better, kept in reserve. After all, Marcus wasn't the only one who had underestimated his wife. The sun had fully set now, the Pacific a dark mirror reflecting the lights of ships heading to distant ports. Somewhere in a federal holding facility, Marcus was beginning his first night of real dependency, no longer able to pretend at power or success. "Update the files one last time," I instructed Claire. "Then seal them. Marcus's story is finished, but mine." I gestured to the city lights spreading below my window, each building, each property, each investment representing genuine success built on real foundation. Mine is just beginning. The security feeds showed one final image, Marcus being led to his cell, no longer the man who had laughed at his dependent wife. In the end, he had learned the hardest lesson of all, that real power doesn't need to be displayed to be real, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should fear the most. "Close the Watson file," I told Claire, turning away from the window. After all, revenge wasn't just about destroying someone's illusions. It was about revealing the truth they had been too arrogant to see. And Marcus? He had 6 years in federal prison to reflect on just how completely he had underestimated the wife he thought would never leave.